Order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee for our evidence session on carers allowance. I think members will know it's been announced overnight that the former chair of this committee, Frank Field, who had become Lord Field of Birkenhead, has died. I think everybody knows, before entering the Lords, he was for 40 years the MP for Birkenhead, and he was my predecessor as chair of the committee and also chair of previous select committees as well. And I did just want to make the point that Frank dedicated his life to the fight against poverty, setting up the Child Poverty Action Group in the 1960s, and then campaigning throughout his time in Parliament. And he did achieve a great deal, and in doing it, he managed to transcend party divisions, as some of the tributes overnight have recognised. He is going to be very greatly missed across Parliament, and I think mourned across the country as well. And I'm sure I speak for all members of the committee in just paying tribute to his achievements and his memory. Can I bid a very warm welcome to the witnesses who joined us this morning, and can I ask each of you very briefly to tell us who you are, starting with Becca Lacey.
Hi, good morning. I'm Becca Lacey, and I'm a reader in Social and Lifecourse Epidemiology at the Population Health Research Institute at St George's, University of London. And I lead research that looks at inequalities in young caring and inequalities in the outcomes for young carers in the UK.
Thank you very much. Andy McGowan.
Good morning. My name's Andy McGowan. I'm the Policy and Practice Manager at Carers Trust. So Carers Trust is the infrastructure body for local carer services of a network of around 130 local carer organisations. And so I lead on their UK policy work in relation to young carers.
Thank you. And Alek-Zander Chullan-Hoyte.
Good morning, my name's Alek-Zander. I'm a young adult carer. I look after my mum who has the condition called polymytosis, and it's a degenerative spinal condition that affects the muscles. Also has a number of other issues as well. I benefit from services provided by my local Young Carers project, and from opportunities from Carers Trust as well.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And should we call you Alek or Alek-Zander?
You can say Alek.
Alek, right, okay. So my first question is for you then, Alek, and thank you very much for joining us. Just looking back then over your experience caring for your mother, how old would you say you were when you became a carer? And looking back at that experience, is there support from the Department for Work and Pensions that you wished that you'd been able to get or not?
So to answer the first part of your question, I was identified as a young carer when I was about 12 years old. I think my mum was coming out of hospital at the time, where I was identified by a social worker who referred me to my Young Carers project, and then that's where I got the support that I'm still benefiting from to this day. And so could you repeat the second part of your question, please?
Well, so you were from the age of 12, you would say that you were a carer for your mother. And did the social worker kind of ask you to take on the role, or did it just kind of happen?
No, it's sort of, because I'm the only child in my house, I haven't got any sort of other relatives to rely on, so it kind of automatically fell onto me to sort of provide a care responsibility. And it was only then that, being identified through a social worker, I think it was a leaflet or something about my Young Carers project, which was Lambeth Young Carers at the time. And we got in contact with them, and they did an assessment on me to sort of assess my care responsibilities, see what I was doing around the house, and then that's where I was identified as a young carer.
And looking back on all that, is there support that you wished you'd had from the benefit system, which perhaps you should have had, or was that not really an issue in your experience?
That was never really sort of considered, because I didn't really understand what I would be entitled to at the time. I think it was only sort of after turning 16 that I became aware of what is now called carers allowance, that is something that is financial support provided to carers like myself. But unfortunately, because I was in full-time education, and I have been since the age of 18, and then going on to university at 21, I wasn't entitled to that because I didn't meet the threshold for carers allowance. And then going onto work where I'm at now, because I work over the threshold in terms of hours, I'm still not entitled to that allowance.
So you've never been entitled to carers allowance through that whole
Never.
period? No. Okay. Well, we'll ask you some more questions about that, but thank you very much for being willing to tell us about it. Sir Desmond Swain.
Starting again with Alek, There are different estimates for the numbers of young carers. If we're going to help young carers and young adult carers, we first have to identify. I've got an estimate here on a school census that's just 40,000. In the 2021 census, there were, I think, 127,000. What are the issues, the difficulties with actually identifying young carers? How can it be improved? And what can the DWP do to help with that process?
I think, going from the top of my head, I think perhaps a set of criteria in terms of number of characteristics where a person may be a young carer, a person may not be a young carer, and I think implementing that in different areas. So, for example, in the schools in particular. 778. But yeah, identifying young carers through schools, using the criteria to identify through schools, through hospitals, through other sort of day-to-day areas of life as well. I think Andy may be able to touch on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, really happy to come in. It's fine. I think it's a really important point because the challenge is, as you say, the estimates from the census are based on when adults are asked the question. And I think what we are seeing, particularly post-COVID, is when you ask young people themselves, you get a much higher and a much more accurate reflection as to how many young carers there actually are. So in relation to young carers under 18, the 2021 census identified around 127,000. Yet looking at a variety of different studies where young people themselves are being asked, actually we're looking consistently at around over 1 million young carers under 18 and another 600,000 young adult carers. So we're looking around 10% of all young people, so it's not a niche group. I think in relation to the issue around identification, I think the big challenge is many young carers don't see themselves as young carers, so it relies on the professionals working with them and their families to be able to identify that they might be a young carer. I think what we heard in Alek's situation is a prime example of how the system should work. Mum was being discharged from hospital, social worker comes in to look at what support's needed for the family, identifies Alek might be a young carer, linked into support. But we did a snapshot survey in 2022 which found that on average young carers were caring for 3 years before being identified, and most concerningly there were young carers who started caring when they were 6 but were only identified when they were 16, so 10 years without any support. And in terms of the specific what are some of the opportunities around that DWP can do in relation to the identification piece, what we see through our network of young carer services is that schools and children's social care are by far the biggest identifiers, and it's usually when young carers reach crisis point. What we'd like to see is actually more awareness, so first on the education side in further education, universities, training providers, but also with employers. I think there's been a big focus on the back of the Carers Leave Act on carers who are already in work or maybe wanting to return to work. But actually we feel there needs to be a greater emphasis on how we identify those young people moving into work for the first time. And I think my final point on this is we recently, as part of our Young Carer Futures programme, delivered a young adult carer awareness raising session specifically to staff working in 2 of the youth hubs, so in 2 particular geographical areas. And before the session, we asked them what their awareness was around the needs facing young adult carers and their ability to support. And 3/4 of staff working there said they didn't understand what the issues facing young adult carers were, and around 70% said they didn't know how they might be able to support young adult carers. So I think that highlights a real opportunity to actually how can we replicate that sort of approach across the vast number of youth hubs that we've got through some of the DWP's Youth Offer programme.
Can I come in on that? So I've got a couple of points to follow up. So firstly about identification, I think we hear time and time again that what it takes for young carers to be identified is a crisis or a series of crises, if it happens at all. And I think we're really hampered by a kind of general lack of societal awareness of how many young people this is affecting. So some of the research that Andy just mentioned, actually there's research that we've done and we are going to be publishing very soon. And since the pandemic, the estimates of young caring have really increased. So we think it's about 12% of young people who are young carers now. So that equates to more than about 1.1 million children across the UK. So we're not talking about small numbers here. And just speaking again to the sort of importance of that early identification, we've got some research that we're doing with Carers Trust that shows quite clearly that mental health and well-being of young people is impacted very quickly after they become a young carer. So it really points to the importance of that early identification, but also for early support for mental health and for trying to alleviate the kind of care burden that many young people are facing. And there's a really important inequalities angle to that, because we see that that's particularly the case for young people who are in the lowest income households across the UK. Their mental health and well-being seems to be particularly affected as well. So we've got to do better at supporting and identifying those young people in particular. And we know that mental health has a really important knock-on consequence for young people for remaining kind of engaged and able to go to school. We know it's a really important determinant as well for going onwards to things like further and higher education and into work as well. And then just to speak again to the point about data, I think a lot of people think that the census is an official source of data. It's very good for lots of things, but actually it's very poor for when we're looking at young caring, because, as Andy mentioned, it's answered by adults in the household. So it's a massive underestimate of the numbers of young carers that we have in society. And the school census, it's brilliant that we have now a question about young caring on the school census, but that relies on children being known to schools as young carers and being reported by the schools on the school census form. So there is a couple of hurdles there. And so the research that we do is a research that's asking young people themselves, and we use big UK representative samples to do that. So we're not talking about small numbers of young people here.
Thank you very much indeed. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I want to follow on from that, if I could, and start with Alec, if that's all right. I just wondered, from your own experience, what was the impact, what is the impact of you caring for your mum on your health and well-being?
That's a good question. I think from a younger age, I would say there was definitely times where I couldn't focus as much as I'd like to on my education, because there's a lot of time that I have to take out to sort of do responsibilities around the house, take mum to appointments, for example, and then that would allow me to, I wouldn't be able to go on opportunities and meet up with my friends, for example, because I haven't got that time to do that. And I think going towards sort of further education and then into work as well, I think that had a sort of, I don't know, it's funny because you can't really focus so much on the job at hand, because you're always sort of thinking in the back of my mind, is my mum okay, how is she doing, stuff like that. Especially now, she's a little bit more independent, but there's times where she could, for example, have an accident, and it's sort of a constant worry as to what might happen if I'm not there, what might happen if I go on holiday, for example. So there's always that sort of constant worry, and then that might sort of affects my own sort of mental health as well. And I think that definitely has had a sort of negative impact, especially within the last few years or so.
Did it change over COVID? You couldn't get out and about. One of the things that I understand from young carers, I did a project on young carers and the impacts on their health many years ago, and I remember that being a real issue, that if you're spending a lot of time caring for your relative or sibling, you may you're less likely to be able to go out and be with your friends and so on, and then on top of that you got COVID and so on. Did it affect you more during COVID?
I think it did as well. I don't think it affected me as much, but I think it affected more how I could sort of look after my mum, so to speak, because I think because from COVID, she was a lot more afraid to go outside, so to speak, because of the virus and the impact from that. And I think that may have impacted me in terms of encouraging my mum to go out and be a little bit more independent, and it sort of makes me think that I'm not doing as well as I could do as a carer, because that should be my role, to sort of encourage her, be more confident for her to go out, and I can't really do that as well as I would have liked to.
Thank you very much, Alec.
Okay.
I'm going to move to Becca, if that's all right. Becca, I know you've undertaken this longitudinal study, and as you say, that's provided much better quality data in terms of your work around young carers. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's been more than one study. So we've had a whole programme of research where we've been looking at the longer term impacts of young caring and young adult caring across the UK. So everything that we do uses really great data. So it uses data that's funded by the ESRC. It's called Understanding Society. It's a really big UK-wide study that's followed people up since 2009, and it's representative of the UK. So I've already spoken a bit about the sort of prevalence stuff that we've done, and that really shows that the prevalence of young caring has increased since the pandemic. We thought it was about 8% of young people who had care responsibilities before COVID. Since COVID, it looks like it's now about 12%. So that has increased. It's a really substantial. I mean, in terms of absolute numbers, it's a big increase in terms of number of people. And there's a really big inequalities aspect to young caring. So this is some research that we've been doing alongside Carers Trust. So a young person's chances of becoming a young carer are not equal. I mean, it seems obvious to say that, but actually the inequalities are really stark. So we're showing that young carers are 2 times more likely than their peers to come from single-parent households. They're 4.5 times more likely to come from households where parents are not working. 2 times more likely to come from families where parents hold primary or secondary school level qualifications as their highest level of qualification. And they're 3 times more likely to be living in the most deprived areas of the UK in terms of the index of multiple deprivation. So I think this is really kind of important context for our discussions this morning about how we can kind of better support young carers to access things like further and higher education when we're talking about young people who are coming from households where there's going to be little in the way of financial support to realistically access those opportunities. And actually those sort of lack of finances will also be one of the reasons why young people are caring in the first place, and particularly those that are caring for a huge number of hours as well.
Does the study cover in terms of the impacts on health, including mental health? It does, right?
Yeah, so I've mentioned that a little bit before. So because we've got longitudinal data, what we can look at, which is quite neat, is we can track individuals over time. So we've got a study coming out where we've looked at individuals up to 11 years prior to becoming a carer, look at how their health, what sort of trajectory they're on, how becoming a carer affects their mental health, and then subsequently for about 11 years after. So we can look really long term, and importantly we can compare them to their peers who don't become carers. Yeah. And that was the research that I was talking about before, is that we can see that really quick impact on mental health and well-being, and then also the inequalities in that as well.
Talking about socioeconomic inequalities, are there any other cohorts that are particularly adversely affected?
Sorry, what do you mean in terms of other cohorts?
So in terms of, I understand from other work, for example, single parents, groups of from black and minority ethnic communities and so on. So are they also disproportionately disadvantaged?
That's what we're doing right now, actually. So I can't tell you too much about those results literally right now. We're literally running that this week and next week.
There's a study, I think, that was published in the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Journal in January, which was very much pointing to that as well.
Yeah, so that is a really big focus of our work. So we really I'm a social epidemiology. We really take that inequalities angle to everything we do. So we are hoping that we can pull out the particular groups of young carers that have particular disadvantage in terms of their longer term outcomes. So by looking at different ethnic minority groups, looking at different levels of household sort of finances and economic position, and also looking at gender inequalities as well will be an important one.
Just for the record, when did you start your longitudinal study?
So we've been working on young adult carers since, when did we start Eurocare? 2020. But the data that we use goes back to 2009.
Very helpful indeed. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're delighted to welcome the Chair of the Education Select Committee with us. Robin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to be able to join you, so thank you for the invitation. And I wanted to ask about the 21-hour rule and the impact of that. I mean, you mentioned, Alec, that you were unable to get carers allowance during your studies in further education and higher education. Yeah. Because of that. Can anyone on the panel just give me sort of a broader view of the impact you feel that has on young carers?
Absolutely, I'm happy to start. I think one of the challenges we're really seeing with the 21-hour rule is the impact on sort of choices that young carers feel they can make. I think what we are seeing is in terms of young carers where potentially the course they want to go on to do, particularly because we see through our young carer services that maybe the sort of immediate time after school, 16, 17, they may well actually be catching up and sort of redoing because actually their attendance and attainment in GCSEs has been impacted. So when they're starting to think about what choices do I want to make about my future career, what educational choices, actually we are hearing from young carers where they're having to decide, well, if I do this full-time course, that's most linked to into what I want to do, and actually that's going to serve me better in terms of my knowledge. But actually I'm very mindful that if I do the part-time course that's less than 21 hours, of course, they don't look at it into the 21 hours and 20 hours, but that's the reality. If they do a part-time course, they know they'd be eligible for carers allowance, because the thing we have to remember is that the amount of care they provide isn't changed by the 21-hour rule. What changes is in terms of the impact on their ability to study, but also the other concern we're seeing is the number of young carers who, alongside education, are also taking up employment alongside because of the lack of financial support, either through sort of the wider sort of DFE mechanisms and sort of the maintenance system, but also through carers allowance. So, for example, for Young Carers Action Day, I brought a young carer to Parliament who's currently studying the International Baccalaureate, a really intense, really sort of full-time programme. She's holding an offer to go to Oxford University next year, which is amazing. She's brilliant. But because she doesn't qualify for any financial support at all, she's currently holding down 3 part-time jobs alongside studying the IB, because what she's finding in her area, she can't find an employer who can offer enough hours, but also the flexibility around her caring role and her studies. So for her, understandably, one of her biggest concerns now is, actually, am I going to have the time to be able to juggle employment and my caring role for my sister, and then also get the offer? And so that's then impacting on her mental health, and I think that's the area we're particularly concerned about. As Becca said, we know for young adult carers they are more likely than their peers to report severe psychological distress, self-harm, and most alarmingly make attempts on their own life. Sutton Trust Cosmo study showed that. So I think what we haven't looked at in as much detail from a policy perspective is what are the implications on the mental health and well-being of young carers not having this financial support. Because I think, well, we may well come on to the principles of carers allowance later, but one of the founding principles historically has been in terms of providing support when carers are unable to be in full-time work. That has been one of the founding principles of carers allowance. For adult carers, in terms of it's that balance between caring and working. For young carers, you have to add into the mix that balance between caring, working, and also education.
Qualifications, yeah.
And I think that's the concern. And also, what is the long-term impact if they're not able to stay in education or go on to sort of further and higher education as well?
And if I think about education policy at the moment, we've got the Department for Education increasing hours post-16, focus on people taking more A-levels, the Advanced British Standard, potentially broadening the curriculum to be more like that IBAC scenario, and T-levels being more demanding than previous vocational qualifications. All of those things are going against the direction of travel. We're saying only 21 hours of study, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think it's worth reflecting that the education landscape has changed massively since Carers Allowance came in. Carers Allowance hasn't changed in terms of its approach, even though we changed the focus about young people being in compulsory education till 18. So I think the Carers Allowance context and the rationale and policy hasn't kept up with changes in educational policy, but also practices. We know many more young people are taking on paid employment, particularly because what Becca was saying, because they haven't got that financial support available in the household to give them access to the same opportunities.
Yeah, I'd like to come in to just say that I think that, you know, the current system for carers allowance and that 21-hour rule, it just means that there isn't a level playing field for young carers compared to their peers when it comes to opportunities and accessing those opportunities. There's no young person should be having to choose between financial support and getting an education. And I think we know that education is so important for social mobility in this country, and the importance of this stage of the life course for kind of setting people up for sort of careers that they want to have and for their kind of own aspirations. And another point on that is I think this is a really important sort of point of intervention for trying to break that cycle of the young carers becoming the cared for of the future as well. So education being a potential route. And actually, just to come on from that, just thinking about some of the longitudinal research that we've done, which really helps to evidence that difference between young carers and their peers in terms of what they can access. We have found that young carers are 38% less likely to go on to hold a university degree than their peers. And this varies really considerably by the number of hours that a young carer is providing, to the extent where if somebody is providing 35 or more hours of care per week, they're 86% less likely to hold a university degree than their peers. So it's a really big, extreme difference that exists at the moment, and it's probably partly a consequence of...
And yeah, I mean, certainly from my experience of young carers working with them in Worcester, is these are people who are, in many respects, more mature than their peers, more organised, having to juggle many things already, and therefore really very ready to take on either study or work if they get the opportunity. So it's a huge waste of potential if those people don't get to advance. Is part of the problem here, and you mentioned obviously not keeping pace with education policy, is part of the problem where the ownership sits. Is you've got DWP, which is responsible for carers allowance, you've got DHSC, who are responsible for care and also the mental health sort of side of things, which Debbie's brought up already, and you've got the Department for Education, who are responsible for the qualifications. Are they just not talking to each other enough, do you feel? Is that part of the issue?
I think in relation to carers allowance, I think that is absolutely where the opportunity sits. I think we'll no doubt come on to what's happening in Scotland at the moment, but that's where actually they've revisited what is the purpose of carers allowance, but also what are we trying to achieve. So Scottish Government acknowledged that the 21-hour rule was a barrier to education, and they also decided to focus not on the ability to be in full-time work, but actually the inability to be able to take on any type of work for students. And I think that's a really sort of key point. I know the government's current view on this is that those carers who are in education should be supported through the maintenance system. So referring to, in numerous sort of parliamentary answers, to the grants and loan system. I think it is really important to note that in England, since 2016-17, there hasn't been any maintenance grants. We only have a system of loans. I think the other factor to bear in mind is that support doesn't take into account everything Becca was saying about the increased sort of levels of financial deprivation faced by carers, but also the wider educational challenges and barriers they face. So I think there is absolutely that need for a joined-up approach, because I think if we look on the DFE side, we have the 16 to 19 bursary. There are a small number of sort of groups at a national level, so children who've been in care, children who are sort of financially independent, and those who are receiving DLA or PIP. And the rationale for that is because they haven't got that financial support to be able to support them through their education. But if you've got no adult in the household who's able to work, if you're in a single parent household when you're caring for your parent with health needs, in reality, you haven't got someone who's able to financially support. And I think that's what we've seen from the changes in Scotland, is actually young carers being able to access some of the opportunities that Alec talked about earlier as well. So I think that's a real opportunity to look at how do we tackle this situation.
Becca, in your studies, have you got any figures for how many young carers do manage to access any kind of educational maintenance or support, both in FE and university?
Not right now, but I could follow up with the committee in writing about that. I'm very happy to do that.
I mean, that would be really interesting, and certainly interesting from the perspective of our committee as well. And I mean, coming to you, Alec, here, obviously you managed, which is phenomenal, to get through that post-16 educational piece and to go on to study at university. How did you manage that?
So during college there were grants provided to me, but that wasn't just for my care responsibilities. That was because of my household income at the time, and I was working alongside that as well. So that was mainly the gist of how I managed to survive through that. And then for university again, there was grants and the maintenance loan as well that helped me get through university at the time. It was quite difficult because my university accommodation was very expensive at the time, and
London.
No, I was outside of London.
Okay.
So I was down in Portsmouth, but even there, the accommodation was quite expensive. Yeah. If it wasn't for those grants that I was getting, that wasn't young care specific. That was just general grants because of my household income. And if it wasn't for that, alongside some financial support from my mother, then it would have been very, very difficult.
And I mean, it's fantastic that you were able to take those decisions and go down that route. Did you at any point get discouraged because of your caring responsibilities from being able to pursue studies?
Fortunately, I didn't, because my mum was very encouraging for me to pursue my education, and I think if it wasn't for that, then it definitely would have been a lot more difficult to follow through with education.
And in the group that supports you, presumably you talk to other young carers in that respect, do you find any of those people are not pursuing those types of opportunities because of their caring responsibilities?
Yeah, because everyone's caring responsibilities are different, and then everyone's opportunities are different as well, so it really depends from carer to carer in terms of what they would like to do in the future and what their current situation is on their care responsibilities.
I'll come to you in a moment, Andy. Just you were 12 years old when you were identified as a young carer, and as I said, that's sort of an example of good practice when it comes to children's social care.
Yeah.
What difference, if any, did it make to you at school? And did your school or your college specifically identify you as a young carer and treat you any differently as a result?
That is a very good question. I have to think about that. I would say no, because I think the concept of what a young carer actually wasn't really understood, so to speak. So I think going to how I was identified, if it wasn't for that social worker, there wasn't another opportunity, even up to now, where I would have been identified. So if it wasn't for the social worker, I don't think I would have been identified as a young carer even now. And I think in terms of schools, knowing what young carers actually were, again, it wasn't really sort of a concept that was understood, so they didn't really know what sort of support or assistance that teachers could have provided to young carers in the schools. And because of that, I think I didn't really benefit from any support at all from the school's side. I think they did know that I was a young carer, but they didn't really provide any support to sort of follow up on that. And going into college, it was a similar sort of thing, and especially where my mum never really attended parents' evening. They understood the reason why, but never really sort of acted on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, it's striking, because I guess there's an example of good practice there in that you were identified relatively early. You know, the support was there, but even then, the rest of the system didn't necessarily dock into that and wasn't able to provide the right support. And it's certainly, I mean, I know just talking to my schools about these issues, that it's a very mixed picture. Some go out of their way to try and identify and support young carers, but they're probably the minority.
Yeah, and I think that is changing as well. I think, especially now where teachers are kind of understanding what a young carer is, and people like Andy, for example, are going out to schools, Carers Trust and my local Young Carers Project, they're going into schools and sort of providing that training as to what a young carer is and what support might be needed for them. But because it was, so for me personally, it was too late for that, so I never really got to benefit from that.
And Andy, you wanted to come in earlier, but also just how do we go about providing a better balance between those educational and caring responsibilities and provide the opportunity to do both?
Absolutely. So just in terms of the points from earlier, I think what we've got at the moment is a real postcode lottery, both in terms of access to support in education, particularly further education and higher education, and also those maybe undertaking apprenticeships. I think over the sort of past 7 or 8 years, we've run a programme called Young Carers in Schools alongside the Children's Society, and that, alongside with a lot of the policy developments, in fairness to DFE, in relation to young carers, they are much more prominent in DFE policy now. But I think what we still have is that real variation. And I think the other barrier that we often face in relation to, you asked Alec about going on and feeling pressured not to go, is I often hear from young carers talking about that concept of guilt, saying actually, A, they know if they go away to university or if they go into work, maybe a parent at home will have to pick up more care. But also then it's that financial challenge of being able to afford to go away to university or to undertake a course from that perspective. In terms of how do we tackle this, I think improving support and the life opportunities for young adult carers is a prime example of why we need a cross-government national carer strategy. As you mentioned, in terms of issues around identification of young carers and education, sits with the Department for Education. Issues around how do we support young adult carers to get into employment, issue around benefits obviously comes within DWP, but the fact that we've got over 115,000 young adults in England and Wales caring for more than 20 hours a week, 30,000 of those are caring for over 50 hours. We're not going to tackle getting these young carers to achieve their potential if we don't get that right within social care. And I think that's a prime example of where actually you need that cross-government sort of approach to how do we tackle this strategically as well.
Thank you. Becca, can I bring you in on that?
Yeah, I think Andy's just made a really important point. I think we need to take a step back to think about how we reduce that care load. There's really excessive levels of care load for some young carers, and as Andy says, with those, again, are not small numbers of young people. So thinking about how we can, I guess, broadly improve population health. But I just wanted to go back to the point about the sort of barriers to accessing university in particular. We are increasingly seeing that young carers are having to make decisions that are not matching what they really want to do. So they're driven by the practicalities of, well, can I afford to go and stay away from home? Is that who's going to look after my mum, for instance, if that is the case? I think university and university funding also has a very traditional picture of what students look like, that they come from, not all students come from middle-class two-parent households, and that's particularly not the case for young carers, as we're seeing as well. So I think that's such an important part of the context. But I think we've got to think about how we kind of better improve access to universities, because some of our research has shown that actually, I'm going to talk briefly about that really big difference in obtaining a university degree. But actually what we show in that study as well, which is a potential point of intervention, is that where young carers go on to obtain a university degree, we don't see any difference in terms of their access then to work. So I think that is a really key intervention point. So if I think we can get that kind of financing around and the equality of opportunity there around accessing, the careers that young carers want to pursue, that would make a really big difference.
That's very striking, and I think one thing that may be helpful in that respect is the move towards, with the lifelong learning entitlement, people being able to take courses in a more piecemeal fashion and engage with that, and I think that would be worth exploring with universities. Are there any universities that stand out in terms of their approach to young carers or their willingness to engage with this issue and make space? It's interesting. I mean, I've meetings with people like the Purpose Coalition who are saying that they are very interested in supporting social mobility. This would strike me as a good area for them to focus.
Yes, no, so we host a network called the Young Carers Allowance. We have seen a number of universities sort of joining in terms of the Alliance and also looking at what they do in their own institution. I think in terms of we're a long way behind where we've been in schools. I think in terms of from a school's perspective, it's been on the radar nationally for, as I said, about 7 or 8 years. Young carers have only just been added to the Equality of Opportunity Risk Register that the Office for Students do this January. And so I think that was through work that myself and Becca did to help make that case, because they weren't included on the first iteration. So I think there's definitely the appetite there in terms of for universities. I think it's how do we get that consistency, because again, one of the young adult carers I recently brought to Parliament, she was looking up different universities and she typed in carer to one of the universities websites and it came back, did you mean career? And I think that's a really tangible, simple example of how that could put off in terms of a young adult carer, particularly if you've had really good support at school or college, to then look like there's no support available. So I think getting more consistency around support in higher education is really key, and I think that's where the role of OFS can really help with that in ensuring that change is sort of moving forward.
Thank you very much indeed. We are a bit up against the clock now, which I apologise for, but let's bear that in mind. Nigel Mills.
Thank you, and sorry for being late. Alec, what support would have made a difference to you in school? What would have helped you through all that? Was there anything in particular you wish you could have had?
I have to really think about that. I think it would have been nice to sort of have a bit of mutual sort of understanding in terms of, I think, support where my caring role was better understood, and the schools could have helped by, for example, providing maybe a bit more respite or relaxation in terms of getting into school on time, or with homework and tasks and exams even. And
Can I ask you, did you ever have to miss school?
Not too much, thankfully. I think there may have been times where I had to, it was a long time ago, I'm trying to remember back in my head, but I think there may have been times where I may have had to leave school a bit early to go to a hospital point with my mum. And I remember when I was moving house as well, during the middle of my 9th year of education, I had to take about a week off school to help my mum move furniture between houses. It wasn't that far apart, but the fact that I had to take time off just to do that, I think it would have been, I did get that support through that, but it was, sorry, a bunch of the answer here. But that's an example of where I would have had a bit of time off for that. And could you repeat your question again, sorry, Nigel?
I asked you what support would have made a difference, but I suppose I could reframe it now by saying, do you think you missed out on anything, or there was stuff that you couldn't do because you were a carer?
Quite a difficult one to answer. I think, to be honest, off the back of my mind, I can't think of too much. I think just because I did relatively okay through schools, but I can only speak for myself. I can't really speak for other carers as well. And I think the support that carers need in general, it depends from carer to carer, because everyone's different. Everyone's care responsibilities are different. So I think I was quite fortunate where not having, it's a bit weird, but not having enough support didn't detriment me too much. But I think it still would have been nice to have the support. Where if there was times where caring was difficult for me, or there were challenges in my overall well-being, I think that would have been the most important aspects of support that has been missed.
If I may, very briefly, when we do surveys of young carers, consistently what they say will help in terms of having a top priority is having more support in education. And in terms of the things that say practically would make a difference is for there to actually be for every school to have a young carer's lead or a student carer's lead, so that if mum's rushed into hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning, they don't have to go and explain to their geography teacher, their PE teacher, their history teacher. So having that young carer's lead who can just help coordinate who needs to be told what support, what flexibility can make a real difference. And then also having a young carer policy which sets out what support is available, so covering a lot of the things that Alex said around flexibility around deadlines. Access to mobile phones is a key issue in schools at the moment. But those practical things just then means that young carers know, if I am struggling, this is what support's available, rather than things getting to crisis point and then having to try and play catch up. And I think that's consistently both for schools but also colleges and universities. And so that's one of the things that we call for, is that for all education settings to be required to have in terms of that lead and that policy. So when DfE next update keeping children safe in education, that's one of the things that we'd really welcome seeing them including in there.
What about your financial situation, Alec? Did you struggle financially because of the caring you were doing? Would it have helped if you'd had access to some level of carer's allowance?
It definitely would have helped a bit, because it would have decreased financial dependency on my mum, and also would have allowed me to sort of work a bit less, so I could focus on those sort of care responsibilities. Thankfully, it wasn't too much of a detriment per se, but it definitely would have been supportive in terms of having more financial support available to me.
Is that typical experience, Andy?
Yes, absolutely. I think in our latest survey last year, actually for the first time, which is why it's really striking, is getting more support with finances and money actually was one of the top priorities for young carers across the UK. And I think what we see in practice, both during the COVID pandemic but since then, is two types of need for financial support. One is where it's potentially sort of one-off support and financial support. So their laptop's broken, actually no one's able to work from that perspective. Or we've seen the issue of siblings, where their sibling, potentially they've got an autistic brother, has actually damaged in terms of the only device they've had in the household. Not being able to replace that can have a big impact on being able to take part in education, access opportunities. But then we also see, in terms of the group of young carers, where it's that ongoing financial pressures. So Alec mentioned earlier on in the session about just not being able to access the opportunities that their peers might be able to, whether that's leisure activities, whether that's socialising, going out with their friends, or even purchasing, so actually potentially the textbooks they need for their course. And I think that's what we've seen from the introduction of the Young Carers Grant in Scotland. One of the biggest benefits of that has been young carers in the evaluation said they've been able to access opportunities that previously they weren't able to. And I think the final point, what Alex said about reducing that need or that pressure to take on more employment alongside education and caring, I think is key when we look at that mental health impact as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Alec, you mentioned that you worked during college and that did you work through university?
Mainly during the summer.
During the summer. What course did you do?
I did law of business. For university, right?
Yes.
Yeah, law of business, yeah.
What were you doing now? What are you working as?
So right now I'm a paralegal in a law firm in the city.
Oh, I know. Obviously deeply impressive, and credit to your mum as well, and credit to your mum for encouraging you. How did you find the transition as a young carer into work, and did you receive any support services to that?
It was a bit difficult, I think, because I was working in retail before, and because they knew my mum personally, they sort of understood what flexibility I needed. But in terms of going into the legal industry where I'm at now, it was a bit more difficult because they didn't really sort of understand they didn't really come to me about any additional support that I may need because of my caring role. And thankfully, I think the pandemic has helped where flexible working has come into play, because I think for flexible working I could, for example, work from home a little bit more often. I could take a little bit more time, so for example, starting work later or finishing work early so I can go to an appointment, for example. I think that has helped a lot, flexible working, in terms of adjusting for my caring role. And where I'm at now, they understand and acknowledge my role as a young carer, so I think accessing a bit more flexibility in terms of working is not an issue because they understand that role. But I think if I didn't have that flexibility, then it would have been very, very challenging, and I think.
Well, lawyers are odd, and I know that because I am one. So I wouldn't expect them to be the best. Did you feel able to talk about being a young carer in your interview, for example, to be paralegal? Was that something that you felt comfortable talking about at the early stages of trying to get the job at all?
That's a good question. I don't think I mentioned it in interview, mainly just because it was a line of question that didn't come up, I think, as well. But if it did come up, I think it would be a little bit challenging to talk about, because I think it may self-consciously maybe impact my ability in terms of whether I'll be suited for the job. And I think that's what I have to say about that.
A lot of parents don't want to talk about their kids or caring responsibilities. I think it's something we've all got to change across the board, so I don't feel bad about that. Okay, did you get any formal support? So you didn't get any kind of DWP. Did you know about DWP the youth offer about helping young carers into work? Did anyone mention the fact that the job centres are kind of set up to support young carers into jobs? Andy, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, okay. And I think that's what we've seen. I think we talked earlier about the prominence of young carers within educational policy, but I think in terms of when we're looking around sort of youth employment and what barriers do we need to try and tackle to support young people into employment, caring responsibilities isn't one of those ones that is coming up on a regular basis. As I mentioned, that awareness raising session we did to staff from the youth hubs was a really good test for us to see what is the level of awareness. And the fact that 3/4 of staff in those settings who are providing that support on the front line said actually they didn't have an understanding of what the needs were, or more concerningly, how they might support young adult carers who they do identify. So I think there's a real opportunity through the youth hubs, but also in terms of youth employability, work coaches, to I think, how do we ensure they've got that awareness, but also when we're thinking about the systems and processes that are in place, are they asking the question in terms of, are they a carer? And then what are they doing with that if they do? And so I think there's a real opportunity then to ensure, how do we make sure that if a young adult carer is identified, say through the job centre, that they're then linked into their local carer support, because we heard from Alek earlier the difference that can make. So I think we're really keen to see an increased focus on young adult carers, given what we're seeing in the data now. Say, if we want to tackle youth unemployment, which I think there is collective widespread support for that, we're not going to do that unless we get it right for young adult carers. And I think in our survey last year, we found that sort of around over 45% of young adult carers say they struggle to balance caring and employment. So I think understanding how can employers better support young adult carers is key, because we've seen a real focus on flexibility of employers through legislation recently. But when we speak to young carers, many of them are working in sectors where actually the flexibility is expected of the employee. They're on shift work, they're hourly paid, and so I think there are real opportunities there to sort of increase the awareness. And I think that the final point I'd like to make just around in terms of the opportunities is, obviously the committee will be very aware about the big focus on the issue of overpayments, earnings thresholds within carers allowance at the moment. Earlier this year, we saw one of the largest increases for young people in terms of wages. We saw 21 and 22-year-olds brought into national living wage for the first time. Both of those developments are absolutely welcome. But I think there is a risk of also unintended consequences. So what we've seen in terms of, if we look just at this year, for carers aged 23 and above, the amount of time that they can work compared to last year has gone down by 8 minutes in order to then put them over the earnings limit. For an 18 to 20-year-old in employment, it's gone down by an hour. And so I think actually for a young adult carer who's receiving carer's allowance, all they need to do is stay on at work for 1 extra hour, and inadvertently they found themselves over the earnings threshold. And I think that's an area where we're really keen to make sure they're not forgotten in this conversation.
Okay, interested to know your view of DWP youth offer and whether you've got any comments on that and whether people know about it. But separately, on the threshold, because we are looking at the earnings threshold and income limits and things like that. But on the previous session, an academic, and forgive me, I can't remember the lady's name. She was brilliant. And the CSJ, they were kind of talking about this on the panel, but she was looking at having an hours limit rather than an earnings limit, because it would allow entrepreneurial people, it would allow high earners to still be carers, but without sort of having to stop work. Have you ever looked at that as a comparison? She said it was happening across Europe in some countries.
Yeah, it's I'm really sorry, I don't feel like I can comment on this. It's not something that we've really focused on in our research. Ours is all more about the kind of longer term sort of social.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just interested. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. That concludes the questions we'd want to put to you. We're very grateful. You've given us a fascinating session of evidence. I think we'd particularly want to congratulate you, Alek, on managing all of this and completing your education and getting into work as well. Well done, and thank you for being willing to tell us about it. Order. The committee is suspended. Thank you.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
Order, and welcome back to the Work and Pension Select Committee for our evidence session on carers. Very grateful to the Minister, Mims Davies, for joining us this morning. Mims, do you just want to introduce your team to us?
Yes, good morning, Chair. And may, before I even start, actually send my condolences to Lord Field's family. Frank, of course, was an expert on welfare, an incredible campaigner, constituency MP, Minister, peer, Select Committee Chair, and he will be greatly missed by us all. I'd also say, on a personal level, when I joined the department in 2019, just before the end of his stint on this committee, I evaded his forensic scrutiny. So, of course, I welcome yours this morning, but I know my private office in particular paid tribute to him, some of those who were there at the time. So may I pass to Vikki and then to Andrew to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. And I think the whole department sends their sympathies. So my name is Vikki Knight. I'm the Director for Fraud, Error and Debt Strategy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Latto. I'm the Deputy Director for Carers Benefits Policy, and if I could add my commiserations to Mr. Fields, I worked for him when he was a minister. Lovely man.
Thank you, Min, for what you said about Frank. We paid tribute to him already this morning. I'm grateful to you for doing so as well. As I think you know, Minister, we've heard that it's quite a struggle to survive on carers allowance and the carer element in universal credit. Why is it that carers allowance is less than, for example, job seekers allowance? Do you think the current rate is adequate? And do you recognise that there is quite a strong case for a higher rate to reflect the value of carers' contributions to society?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the committee's opportunity to talk about carers allowance today. And I think anybody who watched the Westminster Hall debate, and indeed Chair, you took part in it, this is an area of interest for all of us. If we're not carers now, we're likely to need care ourselves. And I certainly have come from a caring family when my dad was made disabled when I was 11. And I know you spoke to young carers about their experience earlier. And so, of course, we must rightly pay tribute and thank our carers for all they do day in, day out. I mentioned on Monday, it's challenging, hard. It's precious time with your loved one, but it's incredibly difficult. And I also wanted to pay tribute to the team at DWP, largely in the Northwest, who provide financial support to 1 million unpaid carers through the Carers Allowance day in, day out. As you can imagine, given the national interest actually this is capturing, and rightly so, as I say, no one is immune to this, no constituency MP, certainly not this department. I think even this week we spoke about your time in the department back in 2008. Carers Allowance has been going pretty much since I was born, and spoke to 2 previous ministers of the department just this morning about, is there something I'm missing? Is there a miracle out there that makes this more simple given a complex, mixed and changed picture? So I think the government recognises and values the contribution that carers make. And Carers Allowance ultimately is to provide a measure of financial support and recognition for people who are not able to work full-time because of their caring responsibilities and their time they need and want to be with their loved one. It's never been intended to be a carer's wage or indeed a payment for particular services of caring. It's not intended to replace lost or foregone earnings. So I think it's important to set that out. The current rate of carers allowance is £81.90 per week. This means that since 2010 it has increased from £53.90, providing just under an additional £1,500 a year through carers allowance. And the current earnings limit for those in receipt of caring allowance for those who are able to maintain contact with the employment market is £151 a week, and that is of course net of the allowable expenses. And of course, in addition to carers allowance, carers on low incomes can claim income related benefits such as universal credit or indeed pension credit, and those benefits can be paid to carers at a higher rate than those without caring responsibilities through the carer element, the additional amount for carers respectively. And of course we have rightly, and I'm very proud of this, since 2010 supported carers by giving them credits to protect their future pensions. And I think certainly when you are sacrificing doing the right thing, I'm very pleased that we as a government have brought that in since 2010. So I hope that covers some of the initial points, Chair.
It's striking that carers allowance is about £10 a week less than job seekers allowance. What's the reason for that difference?
Well, I think I've tried to explain it's a contribution as a measure to what carers do, but it's not intended to be a replacement of a wage. Andrew and I have discussed this at length. And how long have you been in the department, Andrew?
Longer, 30 years.
30 years. And I just want to also say at the outset to the committee and those watching, my own experience, my own interest in this area, paying tribute to the Carers Trust, Carers UK, everybody who does this work, young and old, and I've been there, I get it, and it's a complex and difficult, challenging thing to be doing. And what we don't want is to create a system that's even more complex. This is not perfection, but since I've taken this policy role, it's been a great interest of mine. I've said that to Carers UK. I have a good relationship with them since I came into the House. One of the reasons I'm here is because of caring and the impact of that in my life and my knowledge. And I'm meeting with them shortly to find a way that works for the whole of the mixed picture. I think, Andrew, to the chair's point, it'd be right to say I've been challenging you and you've been challenging me on what is the answer and what could we find.
So the technical answer from when the thing was established in 1976, Job Seekers Allowance is based on your national insurance record. Yeah. So you've paid a contributory Job Seekers Allowance. You've paid 2 years, I think it's 2 years of national insurance, and in return you get Job Seekers Allowance for 6 months without any means test. Carers Allowance is not based on your national insurance record, so it's not based on what you've previously paid in. It's also not means tested. So the original signal was people who've paid into the National Insurance Fund should get a premium for having done so, and that was the original cause for the £10 difference.
I mean, it's probably an outdated basis, isn't it, given all the changes there have been since 1976?
I mean, we were, having philosophical questions just on this yesterday as I was preparing for the committee, and I genuinely am really interested in the committee's views on these issues. I know the previous committee looked at this in 2019. When I joined the department, when Amber Rudd was in the hot seat as Secretary of State, she made some significant changes, and there's interest from there. So if there was a simple answer, I think many that have gone before, and would you be looking at it again now? I'm also equally aware that we've got to get value for the taxpayer. We've got to do the right thing. We're at a benefit administering department. We're not looking to put people into difficulty. My focus is on progression, on jobs, on a completely focused way of supporting the most vulnerable and those people that do the best for society, having that safety net for people. So I think any country, any government is going to be struggling with how do you do this best and how do you help people in those very individual circumstances.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
Do you think it's enough to live on then, Minister?
This is why I think keeping people in the labour market where possible, where they can combine some caring duties with some of their work. We do want to encourage people to do so. The earnings limit in carers allowance is designed to enable carers to maintain a link where possible with the labour market and give them that greater financial independence. Caring can be lonely and isolating. Work can be a positive outlet. And one of the things that if you can get some balance between your hours and your caring means that, this is a positive way for people to keep connected to the labour market and get that wider support. So I would encourage employers, and I know some, for example, are paying the carers leave and are having really positive engagements. I was actually with an engagement with businesses in the city yesterday who are actively doing that. So I think job design and understanding, as I said earlier in the committee, chances are if you talk to anybody, they've got some level of caring or commitment going on, and it's only been ever growing. I think the earnings limit has increased from £139 to £151 a week net of allowable expenses, and that's up by 50% since 2010. And the earnings limit is used ultimately to determine whether or not someone in receipt of carers allowance is considered to be gainfully employed, so about striking that balance between how people actively combine their caring duties with some work where we want to encourage people to do that. But of course there are other interventions, whether it's the UC side of things, whether it's the household support fund, and of course all of the help that we've been giving during the cost of living challenge that we've had, and of course enabling carers to earn more through work whilst keeping their carers allowance is part of the way that we help people to balance that. Mr. Mills, but I've been there when you have a financial shock and you go into caring. It is very difficult to adjust. I totally understand that, and that's what Carers UK are making very clear to all of us.
There was quite a lot there, but it wasn't quite on the question I asked. I mean, we've recommended previously the government should do some kind of rebasing exercise of benefits to check they're roughly in the right place and people can afford to live. I don't think many of us think that a basic level of income support is generous, and yet we're giving carers £10 a week less. And I know we're not trying to pay them for their caring, and we know it's kind of like a gesture, it's not meant to be, but are we not putting them in an impossible position where they've kind of got to care? Maybe they can't get anything else, but we know this isn't really quite enough for them. And it just seems to be a strange position to be.
Yeah, so I think Andrew spelt it out, and I tried to at the beginning of the committee, that this is a contribution to the caring responsibilities, that it isn't a wage. The primary purpose is to provide a measure of financial support. But I think we've always been at pains at the department to say that we try to, and everybody lives differently, everybody has different responsibilities, but it was never intended to be a carer's wage or replacement for services directly. But carers on low incomes can claim income-related benefits such as universal credit or pension credit, and we've tried to make the system work as well as possible. But this is a growing group, and as I've said earlier, anybody who thinks that they might be immune to it needs to think again, and this is something that's happening all across the globe.
Okay, you mentioned they may be entitled to other benefits. I mean, the position is not brilliantly clear or easy for the overlapping benefit rules or the underlying entitlement. I mean, I think we had somebody quite graphically explain that you have to try and explain to somebody claiming a state pension that they need to claim carers allowance, knowing that they won't get a single penny of carers allowance, because if they do get carers allowance, then they might get slightly more pension credit than they currently get because they otherwise wouldn't be entitled to it. And trying to explain that to somebody is a logical thing to do. It's not that straightforward. I mean, is there a way we can at least communicate this better or make that process a bit easier?
Yeah, well, I'm sure Andrew wants to come on into this, because again, this has been something we've been thrashing around extensively since I've taken this portfolio. In terms of the policy and how it works with pensionable age, I understand that. I think one point that you make, Mr. Mills, is absolutely about communication and getting ahead of this and helping people. I think it would be fair to say to the committee, although we send the uprating letter and we engage with people, we send text messages, I think, and Vikki and I have discussed this, how can we get more ahead of the curve using the VEP system? And obviously there's some brilliant advocates and support that we have in this area, but everybody's situation is different, and please contact if your circumstances change. Andrew, do you just pick up on that pension point, because I know that's a frustration many people have. I've thrown that around as well. Can we just explain to those watching in the committee why we're in this scenario?
So if I can outline, as speaking as a technician, I'll just outline that there are three benefits that basically. There's universal credit. So 60% of full-time carers who are in touch with the benefit system, which is 1 million of them, would have capital or income at such a low level that they claim universal credit. So for those 60% of the working age population who are full-time carers, they may claim carers allowance as well, but it's subtracted from their UC, and the UC rules basically are the ones that apply. So the carers allowance for people under state pension age is a benefit that supports people who've got capital or income that puts them above the UC threshold, but nonetheless they're providing care, which means their earnings potential is reduced. It's a kind of reflection of that reduction. When you reach it does get quite common, and this is something we have looked at on numerous occasions to try and sort this through. When you reach state pension age, the state pension is also paid to you as a recognition of the fact that your earnings potential has been reduced because you've probably left the labour market on grounds of age. So we're not kind of compensating you twice through giving you both a state pension and a carers allowance. However, technically, we do ask you to claim carers allowance, because that means we can conduct an assessment in your pension credit claim if you're a low-income pensioner and give you the carers premium. But something I'm kind of quite focused on there is it's not just the financial charge, it's the emotional charge.
Yeah.
It looks like when you reach state pension age, the government doesn't care that you're a carer anymore because we're taking away the benefit that's got the word carer attached to it. So there is something there about empathetic communication, about it's not too difficult to explain. We're not giving you two payments for the same thing, but it is quite difficult to kind of, I would understand that myself, approaching state pension age myself and having caring responsibilities. I would probably be quite offended by that message.
It's quite hard to explain why you'd claim a benefit you won't get. That is a bit confusing. So, Vanessa, you gave us quite rightly a long answer about the importance of earnings and staying in work and staying in touch with the labour market. Can you just explain to us perhaps why the earnings limit's there and why it's set where it is and works how it works?
Yeah, the earnings limit is designed to determine whether or not someone is in gainful employment. It's successive governments that have found a monetary figure is the easiest way to measure this. And I think, as suggested by previous witnesses, there would be some difficulties in moving from an earnings limit and hours limit under current arrangements. So we're coming to increasingly rely on data collected by HMRC and have no regular hours worked information as a way to do that. So I think it's the balance of being clear that people, in order to be carers, will have to take an impact on their earning capacity and the hours that they can work in order to be a carer, as Andrew's explained, but equally to try and keep them in touch with the labour market and particularly, I know you heard from young carers earlier, whether it's in education or as that perhaps that continues as they move in towards working age, it's trying to also help those people when their caring comes to an end, be able to go back into the labour market and not have to necessarily choose fully between working not at all and being able to balance work. I fully appreciate not everyone will be able to be in that position. They may have health conditions themselves, they may be claiming PIP, there may be other things going with themselves individually. And I think, again, this is always going to be about individual situations of both the carer and the person that they're caring for.
You think the cliff edge is a good idea? I mean, it just puts some people in a strange position of get offered a bonus but they can't have it, or there's some extra hours that could cause a real problem, or they're scrabbling around making sure they've paid the right pension contribution in this time period to make sure they're under. I mean, it just creates a level of uncertainty and complexity that's probably not driving behaviours we want, is it?
Yeah, I think any cliff edge, as I think this whole Conservative and previous coalition government has worked when it comes to bringing in universal credit, it is something that we've worked very hard to get away from. If the carer is earning more than £151 a week net, then they are classed as in gainful employment, therefore not eligible for carers allowance. Tapers are designed to make sure that work pays when it comes to means tested benefits. So already they work well for carers who are claiming universal credit. And I think, as I spelled out in the debate on Monday, 90% of those receiving the UC carer element and declaring earnings have a work allowance for those with either a disability or a child. A cost-neutral taper would need to begin at a lower level of the current earnings limit. And I think in the reality, and maybe Angie wants to come in on this as well, we're concerned that perhaps introducing an allowance for some might introduce a disincentive to work for those carers on the lowest incomes, as well as significantly complicating the current carers allowance scheme. But as I said in the debate on Monday, keeping this under review, really looking to try and understand this and find out how we can do something which doesn't create more administration, more costs, more burdens on carers, but actually works best in the largesse of cases. I don't know, Andrew, if there's anything I missed there.
Yeah, I just had one pragmatic point, which is the conditions of entitlement to carers allowance. You're caring for 35 hours a week. That's a really big one. You're caring for 35 hours a week for somebody who's receiving a disability benefit. Obviously, government needs to be concerned that that person is getting the care that's being provided. What we can't do is police. So we police the 35 hours a week at the beginning of the claim. So we write to the disabled person and say, this person says that they're caring for you for 35 hours a week, are they? And then that's the test. We don't then test that again. What we do is have a proxy through the earnings that says, okay, this person now has earnings above a certain amount, and I accept the amount. It can be discussed, but that's your way of kind of testing that the person is still providing such a high level of care that their earnings potential is kind of quite low. So that and it's something that we can, to a degree, and we'll come on to this in a moment later, automate through HMRC, because we can see when people's gross earnings have changed, so that allows us to do something to prompt the person to tell us, is there something going on, do you need to tell us something, have your circumstances changed?
But also when we can, and we talked about it on Monday, where we can see a pattern of hours, and I'm very conscious of employers and carers, and many carers are on 0-hour contracts because that is what suits them according to, and I'm very conscious as well, being committed to a certain hours. If, for example, whoever you're caring with is unwell and you need to do things differently, this is why these kind of contracts can be suitable for some people in some situations. But if there is a pattern, for example, you might be working in retail, you're asked because of holiday to cover a couple of extra hours that week, but there's a pattern that you do a bit more here and there, but you're generally doing the hours as a whole. Obviously our systems and our knowledge and our understanding is built in to try to make sure that that works for the individual who are doing the care, very mindful of individualised work situations and caring situations, and I think the more we can do that, the better.
Robin Walker wanted to come with a quick point.
Just a very brief one, following up on Nigel's point about pensions. One category of people we're looking at closely at the Education Select Committee at the moment is, with Children's Social Care Inquiry, we're looking at kinship carers, and it's very clear a lot of those are grandparents, a lot of those are people who might be living with at least one person in the household on a pension. And it does strike me as particularly difficult, particularly pernicious, the way that all the systems work with regards to that group when they are taking care of children often in very, very difficult circumstances, and they are not able to get the support that would be available to parents of working age. I just wonder, with the work that's gone on a cross-government kinship strategy, is that something that the DWP has been engaged in, and are there any changes you've considered to look at how to support that particular group? Yeah, I'm aware of the work cross-government. I very much welcome that and the work that kinship carers do. I'm not sure if there's anything specific that's come across my desk in the time I've been here, but I'm very happy, Robin, to take that away. Andrew, is it something you've been leaning into?
I can say one thing about that. There are several thousand pensioners on child tax credit. And we think many of them are probably kinship carers, and we're looking now, because tax credits are closing, about where we can accommodate them in the DWP benefit system. I know there will be a lot of kinship. Essentially, the support of the benefit system comes with who gets paid the child benefit. So if the child benefit is paid to the grandparent as the kinship carer, then things should fall into place. If it isn't, then probably not.
But thank you, that's really welcome. And we have a cross-government group where we're going to be focused on disability employment in the next one with DfE and DCMS, particularly on young people. So there are forums where I'm able to take this away, and it's something I've actively, as the Minister in the department, tried to get more of that cross-government cohesion. And I know as an experienced parliamentarian and previous Minister, he knows that's important and we must deliver on.
Thank you. Nigel. Finally, in your continual reviews, have you thought about linking the earnings limit to a multiple of the national living wage, so each year it stays as a certain number of hours working as that, rather than it being a slightly more haphazard way of increasing it?
Yeah, I'll be completely honest with the committee. I'm looking at absolutely everything that works as the national living wage has changed. The group of people who are encapsulated in caring support. We've mentioned kinship caring, the growing amount of people young people maybe with wider support, people 50 plus with musculoskeletal needs. So again, my mind is open on this about how it works with paying the benefits the right way, the least complicated way, but reaching people in the best way so that they can continue and work and try to deal with that cliff edge. And I think if it was easy, none of us would be sitting here again trying to fix this one. And I strongly welcome suggestions both inside and outside of this committee room of how we do it better. I'm working with Minister Whately on wider issues.
Quite easy to say the earnings limit will always be at least 14 hours at the national living wage or 16 hours at the national living wage. That's not complicated, is it?
But that comes with a degree of a price tag, which you'll. But I want people to stay in work and be able to work. Andrew, why isn't it as simple as
It would technically. It's very simple to do it exactly that. It would, as the Minister says, cost money. That's one part of it. The other thing we have to bear in mind: this would only help the 40% of carers allowance recipients who are not on universal credit.
Exactly.
So it's kind of you're spending public money on people who are a little bit further up the income distribution.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm very mindful that any gear change on this, which is positive and welcome, has to work for the whole as much as possible.
It's slightly bizarre, isn't it? I'm caring my 35 hours plus. I've got my 12-hour week job. The government puts the national living wage up. My employer puts my pay up, and now I lose my carers allowance. I've done nothing. I've not changed anything at that point.
Yeah, which is exactly why with Minister Whately and the work that we have in the Joint Work and Health Group and the impact that family carers have in terms of taking the wider responsibility and challenge from wider society and the NHS, I'm very mindful of, and I have put something together which I will continue to try to move forward if that's deemed the best way. As I'm trying to very clearly say to the committee, there's wide-ranging thought and insight on how to do this best. Nigel.
Okay, thank you. Can we come on then to the question of overpayments which arise in the kind of situation that Nigel has described? You've referred to this committee's report, or the predecessor committee's report from 2019 about this. I mean, it looks from the data as though the overpayment problem, there hasn't really been much progress in resolving that over the last 5 years. Or would you say there has been progress, or?
I think a few things. Firstly, I want carers and those watching and those that they're caring for to be mindful that obviously things that are in the national press will be concerning, and that we're a very large department, 80 plus thousand people doing a huge amount of benefit administration. There is always going to be things that go wrong, and we're always very sorry for that. We want to take an individual tailored approach to any situation. 95% in this area go right, and Vikki, I think we're very mindful.
I'm wondering whether there's been progress in the last 5 years on this particular problem.
Yeah, I think so. But for those people who this maybe isn't the case that's gone right for them, they won't be necessarily feeling that.
I understand that.
And when I say, yes, everything's fine, of course it's better, I really do not want people to think, that anybody is going away thinking that that's the case.
What's the progress? What's happened?
Well, as I say, 95% of things are going right. Vikki, do you want to just draw down
so let's say a couple of things, shall I, if that's okay? I will ask Andrew to come in on the VEPS side of it, because I think that is an area to do. But I just want to reiterate what the Minister has said on two things that's important. Where there is an overpayment and people have experienced an overpayment, we actively encourage those people to contact the department if they're finding those overpayments a struggle to repay. As you know, Chair, you've done a lot of work with us on debt recovery, and the letters that we send, we offer individual repayment plans to those individuals. I just want everybody who maybe scared by the reports that we've heard that we've got 2,500 staff in our debt recovery asking to do that. Now, obviously, a priority is how we stop people building up those individual overpayments.
It's the progress on that I was keen to
Absolutely. The first thing that I would say, before Andrew talks about the data that we have from HMRC, is we do ask, and again, for anybody listening, if there's any change of circumstances, they are the individuals that know the very best about how their circumstances have changed. Yep. Again, we would actively encourage people on any benefits where those circumstances have changed, please contact us.
Okay.
Andrew, did you want to talk about the VEP side?
Can I say something about VEPs, which is the reporting of earnings and pensions for income from HMRC? So can I describe the process maybe quickly? Yeah. So somebody claims carers allowance. On average, an average week we had about 7,000 carers allowance claims. We notify HMRC and we say, can you tell us if this person has any earnings? That's for all people on carers allowance, not just those who report earnings. We set out, and then we get a report from HMRC that there has been an alert that this person's earnings, like they have earnings that they haven't told us about if it's the point of claim, or they have earnings which have now gone above the £150 limit. Now those earnings are there, don't take account of the care costs that you can subtract. So we actually have to call them to say, we see your earnings have gone up.
Can I just check, you request that from HMRC when somebody applies for carers allowance, do you?
So we add them to the list of people getting carers allowance.
Right, but these VEP alerts, they're generated automatically, are they? So do you get one every month that somebody who's receiving carers allowance is earning more than the earnings limit?
We get about 100,000 notifications a year. That there has been something with the earnings that either.
What I'm trying to understand is, do you just get an alert at the start when this person who's earning, or do you get it every month?
No, it's a regular feed.
You get it every single month, right? Because I mean, the big puzzle here is how is it then that people accrue overpayments up to £20,000 or more if the department is being told every single month that they shouldn't be getting carers allowance?
Every month when we get them in about. So there's an algorithm we apply to it which calculates which ones are most likely to be generating an overpayment for the various different reasons, like they have not told us they have any earnings or the earnings have gone above the £151. Those people we do contact to say, look, something's happened with your earnings. That may be perfectly acceptable because you may have care costs that you can subtract from your earnings, but can you just let us know if your earnings have changed so that we can calculate whether you're still entitled to carers allowance. The issue will be if they have been on carers allowance for a long time, particularly if they were there before VEPs existed, so we've only been getting VEPs recently, they may have built up overpayments over quite a long period, and by the time that we've uncovered them, it's something we're seeing in the press reporting at the moment.
Well, indeed. Wouldn't it be an idea for the department to write to everybody, once this alert is received, saying it looks as though this person is earning more than being eligible for carers allowance, the department should write to them and say, there is a question here, are you still eligible? Just so that they know, because people seem just not to be aware of it. It happens by accident, as Nigel's described, and then years later they're clobbered, they're prosecuted because they've had a massive overpayment.
I think Vikki's going to come in on this, and if I just may say a couple of things. Chair, you asked, are things better? And I think one thing I would reflect, and one of the points that I think it's important for the committee and those watching to understand, I think it is better in the fact that some of the changes that came in 2019, which has a more individual approach, that we are doing things in a more individualised, and the way that I've been describing is my style and how I'd want this to be administered, and the engagement that we have with those caring. And, I was just here a few weeks ago on safeguarding appointees, visiting officers, getting things right and always having the individual needs at the heart of this. The latest national stats show that the rate of overpayments due to fraud and error fell to 3.6% in 22-23, and that's a 10% drop from 21-22 from 4%. And
that's in carers allowance, is it?
Yes, and the overpayment rate for carers allowance is 5.2%. Perfect time for Vikki, because I'm conscious she's responsible for fraud and error, so it could be in a few weeks we'll back here why fraud and error so large. As equally as why are you pushing to penalise individuals who are doing the right thing.
Let me just pick up Andrew's point about the VEPs. You said that you kind of look at them and see which are the most likely to be problematic, and then you'll pursue those. What are those business rules to determine whether a VEP alert should be actioned?
They'll be broadly speaking, is there a carers allowance case where we think there is no earnings but they're showing up as earnings?
Yeah.
Or is there a carers allowance case where there are earnings but we think it's up below £151 and the vet feed is telling us it's more than £151? Could I ask, you've also asked though for the other ones that we don't actually, should we just write to everybody? Yeah. I think I can probably safely say that is a very legitimate question and clearly will be something we look at.
Okay.
On the earnings point, Vikki, it's 2.1%.
Let me just for the record, let's put the figures absolutely right. So a global level, we're at 3.6%. I'm sure this committee is aware of that, and we are due for the updated statistics on fraud and error for next year. For the previous year will be next month on the 16th of March, 16th of May even.
Is that the global or the carers allowance?
The global. For the carers allowance, the last time we did it sampled was in 2019. So we extrapolate that every single year and we take into account of the increases of that. That's at 5.2%, which is 170 million overpayments. And within that, obviously 2.1% of that is because of earnings. So overpayment due to earnings. And that is a 70 million.
Right, so we don't know whether that's going up or down since 2019?
Well, we obviously, my great analytical, statistical colleagues will make some assumptions depending on where it is. But the last time we actually did the sample was 2019.
Thank you for that clarification.
Let me just put to you, I mean, you as you've touched on it already, the widely publicised Vivian Groom overpayment case earlier this month. The judge made the point that he was truly unimpressed by the department's handling of that case. What is the department's response to that criticism?
Do you want me to do?
Yeah, if you start and then I'm happy to.
So first of all, that I would say you wouldn't expect me to discuss individual cases, and I want to be absolutely also clear that the department, DWP, does not prosecute. We will investigate where we've had those cases. We will refer that evidence from our investigators to our Crown Prosecution Service, and then they will base it on a public interest test, and then they will take that to the courts, and the courts will decide on that. But, we, as we said last month, as the ministers, and you here with Liz Fairbairn, we are a constantly learning organisation. We, of course, look at any complaints, any feedback, and any concerns about that. But I'm not going to cover individual cases, but I do want to be clear, because there has been a number of reports of DWP prosecuting. We are not an organisation that can prosecute. We refer the evidence to the CPS.
Well, when a judge in an open court criticises the department, I think it's fair to ask the department what its response to that criticism is. And I'm wondering what it is in that particular case.
Case is complicated.
Yes, and I think always with individual cases that you see in the newspapers, there's always more to it than meets the eye, hence the test of matters going to the CPS. But the steps before that we engage with claimants, that we try to set up repayment plans and work with them actively to not be into this situation. Where the department's fraud investigators have correctly followed the guidance and the procedure, of course we have a balance of our duty to the wider taxpayers regarding recovering overpayments, and safeguards are in place to manage the repayments fairly. And that's set out in legislation. Claimants have a responsibility to ensure that they are entitled to the benefits inform us at DWP if there are any changes in their circumstances that could impact their award. But I think, as we heard today in this area, certainly for me, more communication, more learning, as you said, Chair, and indeed in the judge in this case, we will look at that feedback. We are a learning organisation, but I would hasten to add that in all cases there's always more that obviously the judge has looked at, the CPS has looked at. Therefore, what we see in the paper isn't always the whole picture.
Can I just ask you about something else that the department said in response to that 2019 report? It said the department will commission and publish new research with carers allowance claimants. The research is expected to report in the summer of 2020. In the debate on Monday, Minister, you mentioned that research and you made the point about how useful it is. And I thought that you were kind of hinting that that research would now be published.
Would I dare hint, Chairman, even in a debate to you?
Now to see it.
So my predecessor, Minister Perskilov, told the committee last autumn that the department obviously commissioned research on the experiences of claiming and receiving carers allowance, and as I hope I've been trying to say, both in Monday's debate and today, we are reviewing that research. We're reviewing that learning. It's, before this was in the newspapers, as I've said, it's a policy area and a huge interest of mine. I was looking at exactly that. And as you know, we commission research.
Publishing it, is that right?
Learning from it and then being in a position to publish it before the evidence is made more widely available. Obviously, the department will not publish a report while any process is ongoing. But of course, I think there's some really interesting stuff in this. What I'm learning from, Secretary of State is aware of your interest, and so for me, I think the hinting that I'd like to be in a position to proceed differently, I'll let you know when I can. But I'm genuinely using it for part of the discussion we're having today.
Right. I think I'm encouraged by that. Right. Okay. Can I just raise one other final point on this?
Andrew's just confirmed that we will be in a position very shortly to publish because the Secretary of State is in agreement with where I'd like to be. So I don't think it will be long coming. So there we go, hot off the press.
Very hard.
Committee.
Thank you for confirming
it.
A final point for me, from one of my colleagues. What discussions has the department had with Social Security Scotland about the rollout of carer support payment in Scotland and the implications for previous carers allowance overpayments?
Yes, again, I feel you should just come to our meetings, Chair, of Andrew and I discussing this roundly. So
please invite me.
Well, you're always welcome. You know the department very well. So what I would say is we are administering this for Scotland and working with them and learning from them. But there is a division here that between what we do and what Scotland needs. Perhaps, Andrew, you could just put some flesh on the bones of that.
In my spare time, I'm also responsible for Scottish Devolution in DWP. So I spend a lot of time discussing exactly this kind of issue with my Scottish Government counterparts. So all of the debt that's attached to carers allowance claims in Scotland transferred to the Scottish Government, Scottish ministers in 2018 when we transferred executive competence. So that is all Scottish ministers' debt, and it comes so they're responsible for that to the Scottish Parliament. However, we have agreed with them that for a temporary period at least, we are administering carers allowance as their agents in Scotland, and that includes we're recovering their debt for them. We're in discussion now about what happens when we transition fully to the carer support payment. So there are no longer any carers allowance cases. We're transferring them successively over to Social Security Scotland. As things stand at the moment, we will continue to make the recoveries as necessary and repay that money to the Scottish Government. But there will come a point where that changes.
Yeah, and I was going to say, in the spirit of, can we do things differently? What's the right thing to do? I think observing with interest the approaches taken by Scotland, they've got the powers to do things differently. We look forward to the evaluation of their new policies and being published themselves once they take place. Andrew, as I say, very, very involved. So, for me, again, it's a matter of interest, and we want to see how that goes.
Thank you very much. Sean Bailey.
Thank you.
Waiting, which I apologise for.
No. So slightly going back a bit. But so you spoke very clearly, Minister, about the kind of changing world that we're in terms of different people caring, more people caring. And I think sort of we are encouraging people to care for loved ones at home. So we're getting lots of people making that choice. We're also encouraging lifelong learning. We know there's going to be lots of different changes of careers. We recognise nationally the new ways of working. We're legislating for flexibility, so there's more opportunities to work around caring responsibilities, which I think does lend to the work that you're doing and looking at this earnings limit quite carefully. So I'm really pleased about that. But what we absolutely know, even if there's a change of earnings limit, is that there is an impact of caring on opportunity, options, and basically changing careers, stepping away from careers. So my two questions with that all in mind is, do you think the department is doing enough to support people as they step away from their careers, and then when they go back, so say for a loss of a loved one, so the caring stops? And separately, are we doing enough to support carers to plan for and save for later life because of the gap that it will impact on their pensions? Because constituents are still shocked by all of this when they've talked to me.
Yeah, thank you. And I spoke out to the committee earlier, the fact that we've supported carers, giving them credits to protect their future pensions since this government came into power in 2010, I think is incredibly important. Through the Job Help website, which I initiated when I was Employment Minister, there's a wide-ranging where to start for many of the people that we come into contact with, and maybe don't as well, but just need help when it comes to the wider labour market and what's next. And there's a section on there about, if you're a carer, what you need to tell us, how to do things. So please do use that on .gov.uk. I think what we've seen is the Carers Leave Act getting royal assent, that ability to give a right to reflect flexible working for employees, where there is better access to that, I think is really important. The measures of the Carers Leave Act, and as I say, some employers choosing to pay and help those that are caring, I think is incredibly welcome. And as I tried to spell out in Monday's debate, I think this is genuinely something where we need a whole system approach. This is not something that DWP on its own can do, that local authorities, the NHS, carers themselves, employers, this has to be everybody working together. Because as I said at the outset, if you're not caring now, you will be, or you'll need to be cared for. As an ageing society with more complex and difficult needs. And work is incredibly good for you in so many ways, particularly as well when, and I know certainly when my mum was caring for my dad, and if only I understood quite so much, and I was young when that was the case for me, I'd love to have been a lot more help myself. So I think understanding this and have employers and sectors battling presenteeism, using virtual and different ways of working, whether this is if you have a disability, if you have neurodiversity, there is a great way of getting more people in the labour market doing more that suits them, that we want to achieve as a society and as government. And I think the more we can do that, I think the Prime Minister spelt that out very strongly on Friday as well. I think it's incredibly welcome, because I continually have, and the Minister for Employment, Minister Churchill, constantly having people saying we've got gaps in the labour market. But have you looked at job design? Have you looked at who's down the road who needs a chance? And also, I do think we need better return schemes, quick return, certain areas, whether it's finance or accountancy, and you've already got a certificate, you can get right back at it. But if there are other sectors that you've been in, it can be more difficult to return. So where we can work with employers and we can work with sectors for return schemes, brilliant. And I was actually with the Beer and Pubs Association yesterday. They've got some brilliant apprenticeships at any age and career stage, which can be done flexibly. So we need to, in my view, and the wider role that I have as Minister for Disabled People, Health and Work. We need to stop talking about inclusion and getting things right, writing nice things on the website, and actually do it. And if we all do it as in a whole system approach, whatever people's circumstances are, we're going to shift the dial on productivity, we're going to have people happier, and we can have a labour market which is truly flexible. It's brilliant, but we can do more.
Thank you very much indeed. Robin Walker.
Thank you. Can I come to the 21-hour limit on the carer's allowance? And we heard some concerns about the way that's working earlier. Can you just talk us through what is the logic of that limit?
Yeah, so as a previous minister in the Education Department, I'm not going to deny that one of the reasons I set a cross-government focus for young people, and again, anyone who knows me knows that that's an absolute focus for me in terms of all of my ministerial role, my focus and time at DWP, to make sure that the system works for young people, whether they are care leavers, carers, or from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think the government rightly thinks it's really important that carers maintain links with the education system, and young carers do an immense job, an incredibly challenging job, stepping up in a way which they are absolute. They are absolutely heroes in everybody's eyes. I think carers allowance was principally introduced as that measure of financial support, so the government continues to think the right way to support younger carers and those in full-time education is via the education maintenance system. We'll know with the previous skills bill and other things about how do we make things work, which is why the general principle for full-time students being precluded from entitlement to income-related benefits or income maintenance benefits is how it is. But I think what we're trying to do is work as ever closely, and this again comes to policy officials and all across Whitehall, every single department, putting themselves in the place of the person we're trying to make this work for. And if we ensure that that's what we do between the two departments, then we make sure that young carers know what support's available for them. We make sure that the education system and the hours work for what they've got to do, and I think that is the way forward. Again, Andrew, we've really been trying to build this point and make sure that when people develop policy, it works for everybody. And would I say this is perfect? No, but I do think there's more to do and more to achieve. Andrew, do you want to add any more on that?
Yeah, I think I'd want to add two things. Hearing what the evidence from the previous session, I think it's quite interesting when people say they don't know whether they're working 21 hours or 20 hours.
Yeah.
We did quite a lot with work with further education colleges, actually, to say your full-time course doesn't count as a full-time course for carers allowance. People can get carers allowance because it's not 21 hours in the classroom.
Yeah.
It's less than that. So actually it doesn't reach the rule. We put up posters and all that kind of things to advertise that fact. The issue with the 21-hour rule is a bit like the proxy rule on the earnings for people who are in employment. How can we ensure that the people who are getting carers allowance are themselves full-time carers? I think there's a hard edge, and that's the kind of thing we do need to look at. And then finally, you made a point earlier about T-levels. We are very conscious of the fact that T-levels don't really fit with the pattern.
And we tried very hard to make that known.
Yeah, and it's not just T-levels as well. I think the work the department is currently doing on the Advanced British Standard is predicated on an increase of post-16 study hours. And so across schools, sixth form colleges and the FE sector, that is about asking students to spend more time. Given the government's other aspiration to have everyone pursuing education, employment or training up until the age of 18, there's a real concern there, isn't there, that young carers who have significant carrying responsibilities might drop out of education. They are already at greater risk of being need than many other categories. Yep. If that rule runs up against the way in which study is being conducted within that age group.
Robin, I've very often, it feels, sat in this committee and made audacious land grabs for skills and other things that work for my claimants, and you tempt me once again on that one. But I think Angie's spelt it out on that cross-government working group that I've set up to make sure that things work for young people, that policies are designed for the most disadvantaged, for the people that are left behind, the people that come to us. You mentioned NEAT. There are kind of times that people end up in the hands of DWP. That is 19, very often at 23, 24. There are points where, hence we built this network of youth hubs and partnerships for that starting place. Quite often for young people who have multiple barriers and multiple needs. I would pay a huge tribute to the FE sector, and many of them really understanding exactly the type of student that you're talking about. And what we really need to make sure is that cross-government partnership and policy designs actually work for those young people. Is it fully there? No. Does DFE need to do a bit more knowledge and engagement beyond the standard pupil? In my view, yes, please. Is all lost? Absolutely not. But I think there's certainly more understanding in those types of groups in terms of that policy design, and we're on it. We've got another meeting shortly with the new minister in place there, and I welcome that engagement, and of course this being highlighted by the committee.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely an area where more work would be welcome. Another area is in terms of the career opportunities for young people. We had the excellent example earlier of Alek talking about the way in which he had been able to progress through FE onto university and into a job, which is fantastic, but unfortunately relatively rare amongst that cohort. And we did a piece of work on the Education Committee on careers, education, information and guidance. One of the areas that was highlighted within that was the challenges facing young carers in being able to engage with some of the support and activity there is. It was quite striking listening to Andy's evidence earlier about the feedback from the youth hubs, that many of them didn't necessarily feel equipped to deal with the issues facing young carers. How can you make sure that there is better support with all the work that the DWP can do in careers at reaching that group? And isn't part of this better constantly putting pressure on the education system for better identification?
I think this is a triangular situation as well, Robin, if I may. There's some great work that DCMS are doing around NEATs and preventing and a helping hand for those people who specifically need this. It's why what we learned in Birmingham and other areas, that we then built this network of partnerships, which some are more mature than others as a result of COVID and doing it during COVID. I mentioned FE. I know, for example, particularly in Kent, around social mobility and understanding the needs, they are particularly good. And I'm really keen to look at where it's working well. So I think you make an excellent point in that. And that's, again, why the Job Help website and youth hubs and the where to start is, whether it's the careers enterprise company. I think generally we need to do careers better for everybody. I think more reaching out from employers and more help with the different programs that we've got at DWP continue to help, and what we've learned through Kickstart, which is throw out the CV, meet the young person, see the talent, and you'll never look back. And I would hasten to add to employers, whether it is young people and carers, people with disabilities, other needs, don't keep creating a digital middle-class recruitment process, because if you really want to be inclusive, you've got to get into that community, reach out and make it a lot easier for people to come over your threshold. You don't know what you don't know. And with carers, young carers not maybe having that support, they need all the more help. But what I would say is, and this stands for, and it goes to Siobhan's point earlier, as a carer, you're an advocate, you're resilient, you're organised, you're a fighter, the skills and abilities you have, and my understanding is what was showcased in the previous session, is undoubtedly incredible, and we need people to understand that. And it's the same also for people that have been in care. they're exactly the same young people, and there is a danger that we talk our young people down, but these particular young people are the most able, and it's just giving them the confidence, the pathways and the network to build from that.
Thank you very much. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm conscious that yesterday one of the Prime Minister's dementia advisors resigned specifically on this issue, and they'll take the point that the DWP isn't responsible for prosecutions. You provide the cases to the CPS around that. Now, he described these prosecutions as beyond the pale. And said that that the department was in breach of their own rules towards protecting vulnerable benefit claimants. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm really sorry to see this and hear this. We've got some amazing champions for sectors that I work with and have developed a really positive relationship with. I know that we make every effort, and I think we've all discussed this morning, we'd like to do more and use better systems, more communication to make sure where, for example, overpayments do occur or there are issues, that where we have a duty to recover them, that it's quickly, it's efficient, without causing undue hardship to those making repayments. And I again pay tribute to Amber Rudd, the Secretary of State, back in 2019, who picked up a huge amount of this, and we continue to remain working with anyone who's struggling. I think that particular case, and anybody reading that would find that disturbing on what they see in the newspaper. And so I thank him for his work. Happy for him to pop into Caxton and have a cup of tea and see if we can, work things out and go forward. As I haven't had the pleasure to meet him directly previously, because I know he was involved particularly with the PM. And but what I would say is, this is very much the exception. I don't want people watching this to think this is any kind of normality or something that they should expect. I think the balance here between fraud and error, getting it right for the taxpayer, and being able to support people and not have them in this situation is key. Vikki, we discussed it again before we came in. Is there anything you might want to add?
Just very briefly, if you want, because I want to follow that specific question.
No, I think the two things I was going to say, as I said last month, you heard evidence from the ministers and Liz Fairburn about how the department protects the most vulnerable people in society. That's no different from our staff that worked in our counter forward function. That is no different. As the minister said, this is a minority of cases. But I do have to say, prosecution is part of our deterrent. As it says in the NAO report in 2023, we do need to use prosecutions as part of our deterrent to fraud and error, but we must do that in the right way and protect vulnerable customers.
Thank you. Absolutely. And then that brings me up onto my question to you, Minister, on Monday in the Westminster Hall debate, because there seems to be a little bit of a paradox in terms of that. So I mentioned the medical advisor, retired GP, who contacted me. She's a medical advisor at the first tribunal level on appeal to disabled people who are also providing care. And she said that she had noticed over the last 6 months this statement that's been included in her bundle, which, well, I'll read it out again, as although Miss X has identified a high level of personal restriction, she is entitled to carer's allowance. To be entitled to carer's allowance, a person must provide at least 35 hours of care to another disabled person each week. The tribunal may wish to explore this further. So what she was saying, say it again, said it on Monday, was that this might seem a benign statement, but it's basically saying, how can you be caring for somebody if you've also got a disability need? And she said, it's her language, I feel it conveys an overall sense of we don't believe you. So how do you said you were going to look into this, Minister. Have you managed to find out why this relatively threatening statement is being included in bundles to appeals?
Yeah, and I understand Debbie raising it, and thank you for doing it again. And I think, as we know, there's around 100,000 people who are on PIP and care and are on carers allowance and have caring responsibilities. I'm very happy to look at why this specific line is there and what is going on there. Is this something? I mean, Andrew, we heard about it on Monday. I don't think there's much I can usefully add unless Andrew can at this juncture, but I'm happy to try to write and say more to the committee.
We are doing some specific work in the department precisely on this issue about people receiving either the higher rate of PIP and carers allowance or in pension credit. One partner is getting a disability and the other partner is getting. But it is perfectly possible for that to happen.
Exactly.
There is no reason why somebody can't be themselves have a high level of disability and be a carer.
Yes.
So we do need to take away and look at it.
Thank you. I'd be very grateful because, as I say, this seems to be a contradiction in terms of the actions that we say about supporting vulnerable claimants and, as I say, really questioning the behaviour of tribunal.
Absolutely.
That's not on. Another question I'd like to make is about young carers, and we're talking about paradoxes again, really. You said in response to Nigel's questions about the purpose of carers allowance was that it is in recognition of caring responsibilities. Now, I don't know, there seems to be something out of kilter when a 10-year-old is deemed to have a caring responsibility and that responsibility isn't being recognised. Why should an adult have their caring responsibility recognised, and yet a child doesn't have that right for that caring responsibility that they're undertaking, often for a parent or a sibling? Why that isn't recognised? So I'll leave that there. But I wanted to draw the point, which I think I also mentioned on Monday, Minister, which was. There are significant mental health impacts for young carers, and these are lifelong. You may care to read not only the longitudinal study that our witness to the previous panel had about that, but there was also a quite shocking report in the Journal for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Mental Health, and that was, as I say, January 24. And they were saying not only is there a disproportionate impact on low-income families, on families of ethnic minorities, on single-parent families, they are also more likely to be hospitalised due to mental health in adulthood and experience suicidal ideation, and that COVID has made this worse. So that's in a peer-reviewed journal. The significance of this, I think, won't be lost, especially in the context of last Friday's speech by the Prime Minister, and really questioning the sincerity and genuineness of young people who are not in work at the moment. So I just want to leave that with you because it is a very significant one. If I could, I'm just conscious of time, Chair. So I'm just conscious that that we're also in terms of the dementia advisor. He said it wasn't just that one thing. It was a pattern in terms of how the government has treated disabled people over a period of time. So in relation to this, I understand that the department has had the UN Committee on the Convention of the Rights of Disabled People on the breaches that they've been investigated most recently over the last 6 weeks, and you've had that since Friday. Can we expect to have this published at any time soon? They had, I understand from the committee, that they had expected it for it to be published on Tuesday, and quite surprised at the delay. And also, when can we expect to finally have the Section 23 from the EHRC and some confirmation around that 2 years on, when the HSC have questioned the department around potential discrimination of disabled people against the Equality Act? What does this say about how the department is treating disabled people?
So thank you, Debbie. Quite a lot in there, as I would expect from you with your characteristic forensicness to me and the department. So a few things, if I may. Look, when my dad was injured when I was 11, and subsequently through the years of looking after him, I know he felt a terrible burden at times, and it was difficult. And so my admiration and respect for young carers who are doing that at a much more tender age without support of wider family or another parent is huge, and we need to be mindful of that. And I think the committee and those giving evidence this morning absolutely shows that starkly. So I think there's some real questions here, as I say, about caring as a whole, and hence again the interest in that. And I agree, as I opened my response on Monday, during COVID, post-COVID, caring has only got harder, and on our young shoulders, of course, it will only be more difficult. And I think we all must recognise that, and I will bear my own responsibility for that. I think, just breaking down a couple of the points, if I may, I think the Prime Minister made a very wide-ranging speech on Friday, which I know some stakeholders and some of the sectors will have seized on individual lines or sentences, and perhaps maybe reading matters into it that aren't there. But I think what we as a department, working with the Prime Minister and working with the benefit system as a whole, communities as a whole, is and certainly since I've taken this specific role, I go into a room, and one side of the room is full of very vulnerable people and advocates for those people who want to be supported, and rightly should be, and want to have the system that works for them. And that is exactly what we're striving for. And any feedback we'll always look and learn from. And the other side of the room is often people who want to be understood about their abilities, what they can do, what they can contribute positively to, and they want a work also potentially to be featuring in that. I don't think it is beyond the wit of man to try to have, and we'll always be striving for this in the department, as any minister sitting before you would, to try to make sure we've got a holistic, individualised approach, an understanding, learning department. We're bringing in trauma-informed approach again for young pet carers and that long-term need for support. For example, HSE and the work that we've done there to bring mental health to have the parity with physical health, so an understanding about that. So this isn't about being regressive, but I think this is about balancing that if you are disabled, it doesn't preclude you from wanting to be part of the labour market, as equally as you being a carer doesn't preclude you. So we need to build a system and continue to give people the confidence that that is there for them, and not be in any kind of scaremongering role, but learning as a department, learning as a society. Are we going to get that right all the time? No. So I think for me, we're on the same page as this. We might be looking at it in different ways, but we're definitely on the same page as that. And equally, we've got a responsibility to the taxpayer to make sure that we're absolutely, and to make sure that but no, the point is that for exactly that reason, for the taxpayer and the most vulnerable, that actually that money is there and available to go to the most vulnerable, that people can, that there is a way of giving a safety net and balancing all the needs across government, whether it's the defence rise that we saw yesterday and the other support that we want to give people, whether it's through schools or the education system, that we find a way that the most vulnerable are supported. And Vikki is the lead for fraud and error. Otherwise, we'll be coming back to report to this committee about why are we not protecting that cash, so because it should be going to the most vulnerable. So for us, it's a whole approach of trying to get that balance right. I would say to the stakeholders and the people listening, people who may be concerned, that is what I strive to do in this role, and I'll continue to have that at the forefront of my mind.
Very much. Well, our time is up. Minister, thank you very much with your colleagues for the answers you've given us. You've indicated that you'll follow up one or two of those in writing, and we'll be keen to do that. I think we'll probably drop you a line, won't we, saying the things that we'd be keen to hear more about. We're very grateful to you. Thank you to the members of the committee as well.
And I welcome this interest, and hopefully we can move together forward on this. Thank you very much.
We'll be keen to work with you on it. Thank you very much. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.